Chapter 4 Our Dash to the Desert. 5 minutes after wheels up, I commented to Uncle Marigot that his jet's vertical rise wasn't as striking as I remembered it. He replied, "Hey, Rook, that's because I brought along my car. Blackie has a lot of steel, fuel, and specialized gear in her. I didn't bother to unload her in Fort Myers, but we'll be happy to have her here out there in the Kalahari." I said, "I got it, thanks. And gee, this will be my first trip to Namibia." He said, "And your first trip to Botswana, too, I bet." I nodded and he continued, "The weird weather spot is right on the Botswana border. The Kalahari has wet parts, parts covered with vegetation, grassy parts, and sandy parts. The region we'll be in is mostly hard pan and sand. It'll be hot, but not as hot as the Sahara Desert because it's over 1,000 meters high, and it'll be dry. But this region's climate used to be very different. And not far to the north, there's the Dragon's Breath Cave, and it holds the largest underground lake in the world." The steward brought us a light meal, and each of us dozed off for the bulk of the 14-hour flight. On arrival in Windhoek, Namibia, a dark-suited man greeted us and told Amerigo that safari operators had hired away each of the guides he'd hoped to book for us. He added that bandits were known to operate in the area, and he offered to accompany us himself. Amerigo declined. He accepted the cartons of water and food the guy had brought, paid, and thanked him. The pilot unloaded the big black car, and the steward helped us pack the rest of our gear into his huge trunk. Amerigo said, "Hey, it'll take us 3 to 4 hours to drive the 300 kilometers, so I'll put Blackie in flight mode for most of the outbound trip. If Tess is actually out there, saving a couple of hours driving might make an important difference. Who knows? Now, Blackie can't fly super fast because I added her flight capability to simply get around traffic jams. Her range and altitude are limited, but they avoid potholes on the road, animal crossings, and who knows what other obstacles." To avoid drawing attention, Amerigo didn't go airborne until we were outside Windhoek, where the road became a clean, straight shot to the horizon. He reached under the dashboard, pulled a lever, and we rose about 10 meters up. He followed the road, offset about 100 meters to the right. The small altitude gain gave us a great view of flat, seemingly endless grasslands that grew progressively drier. We followed the road for a half hour without seeing a single car or truck, and then an electronic voice told Amerigo it was turning 15 degrees south. Amerigo said, "Hey, getting close, fellas. Tank up on water. Grab another sandwich." The terrain now looked more like I thought a desert really should. It wasn't like the Sahara with never-ending huge dunes. It was mostly dry, cracked hardpan with sandy areas and small dunes. We saw occasional rock piles, some bigger than others, and some with fairly high cliffs. Pop said, "Hey, it looks like Blackie could handle this terrain on her wheels if she had to, so long as we watch out for those rock formations." Amerigo nodded. Leo commented, "Yeah, those rocks aren't very high, but I think the vertical walls look like they'd be great fun to climb. Those squared-off edges probably make great handholds." More and more sand covered the ground, and when we'd been away from the highway about 15 minutes, Amerigo said, "Hey guys, flight's over, but before I sit down, take a look at that." He pointed to a massive pile of sand in the distance. It was about 25 meters high and curved away from us. We couldn't see its far side, but it appeared to create a circular wall of sand that could have protected a small town. Amerigo landed smoothly 100 meters from the wall, saying, "I want to keep Blackie away from that so blowing sand doesn't cover her over. She could signal us, of course, where she is, but we don't need the aggravation of digging her out with our bare hands." Well, we put on wide-brimmed hats and sunglasses and pulled a backpack from the trunk with water, food, tools, and defensive gear. Pops and Amerigo buckled on handgun holsters. Kind of got my attention, I'll tell you. And then we went out and headed to climb up the dune. During the trip here, we speculated about what we'd find. Now, I got to tell you, my idea was we'd kind of get out of the car. Uh, well, let me just tell you first. I won the booby prize as the least likely. Okay, I figured we would immediately be confronted by 3 camels, and Fund would be riding in the center flank by henchmen with spears and rifles. But look, none of us imagined we'd need to climb a tall dune where each step advanced you only a couple of centimeters because the sand under your foot just dispersed and you fell back down. Hey, this was hot, exhausting work, but we put off drinking from our canteens until we reached the top of the ridge. The full extent of the sand then came into view. The terrain inside was the same as outside where we'd been, so that cracked hardpan and the blown sand and a few shrubs maybe and a rock formation at the far side. Leo murmured, "We came a long way just to see emptiness. I hope there's a good surprise in here somewhere." Pop said, "I can't figure out how this ring-shaped dune formed and why this spot was protected. Your weather analyst friends, Amerigo, they were right to call this a mystery." I made my hands into a megaphone and yelled, "Hey, Fund! Let's see your camel!" Well, the vast emptiness returned no echo, but the looks I got back from the other 3, well, they said my brain might be fried from the heat. Looking back, I realized they were probably thinking it was stupid to yell and potentially alert Fund or other bad guys that we'd arrived. Oh well, sometimes you're stupid. We skied down the dune, and the fun almost justified the effort of climbing up it. My shoes were already full of sand, so it didn't matter that it was now under my pants and up my legs. The hardpan was visibly empty, so we decided to check out the rock formation. We spaced ourselves 5 meters apart with Pops and Amerigo taking the 2 outside positions. Then things got weird. I was exhausted after about 5 steps. At first, I guess I thought the heat might be really affecting me, but that wasn't it, because I saw the others were feeling it too. After 5 more steps, Leo said he was taking a water break. We 4 slowly came together in a cluster around Leo, and Pop said, "Hey, there's something strange about the atmosphere here inside these sand walls. We don't want to waste time, but we better not push forward so fast that we're not fit to fight if the need arrives." Amerigo said, "Yeah, I agree. And everybody keep your eyes peeled. Trouble could come from anywhere at any time." Before we set off, Leo said, "Pole, pole. We learned that on Kilimanjaro that reducing your speed greatly improves your endurance." Being inside that giant sand wall was like being in a lake of invisible honey. I stopped swinging my arms as I walked because it took too much energy. It was tough to stay alert, as Amerigo had counseled us, because the terrain was so flat and monotonous, and it took concentration to move forward. Despite walking pole pole, we needed a break about every 50 meters. As we advanced, we saw the rock outcropping was much like those we'd flown over, but those had sand piles blown up against them, and this one was free of sand, making it appear higher. When we finally arrived, we walked around it and stopped at a 4-meter wide split in the rock that sloped downward like a ramp almost to the formation's center. The rock wall at its base rose to the formation's pinnacle about 15 meters above. We took a water break and discussed what to do next. Leo said, "Hey, nothing remarkable down here. I'm thinking we should go up to the peak. Why not?" The rest of us agreed. And he said, "Scrambling over and through the blocks around it and those ridges, it really looks slower and riskier than simply climbing straight up to the pinnacle from the ramp's base. So I propose we climb up the wall from the base of the ramp." Hey, why not? We agreed He started down the gently sloping rock ramp, but he moved downhill at an even slower pace than we had on level ground. He looked back at us and shrugged. He was no longer walking through honey. Now it seemed like he was fighting his way through molasses. Pops and Amerigo unsnapped their holsters and scanned the walls and ridge while I followed, turning, looking at every step to see if anything was happening behind us. Descending the short ramp tortured every part of my body. Breathing was nearly impossible. I was huffing, puffing at every step. When Leo reached the ramp's base, he located a handhold and started up. His movements were slow, but he had climbed about 5 meters by the time I arrived. Amerigo said that Pops should go next, I should follow, and he'd take up the rear. Like Pops had said, like Leo had said, the rock was great for climbing, and Pops made it easier by showing me where to find handholds. Nevertheless, every time I raised my arm or leg, it was like the toughest resistance training you could get in a gym. I was about halfway up when I heard Leo shout. I held my breath. I couldn't tell what had happened. Had Leo been attacked? Pops climbed his last few meters like a madman. How could he possibly go so fast through this soup? I asked myself. I started to move faster too, and I figured it was my adrenaline kicking in. I reached the summit ridge just after Pops, and Amerigo was hard on my heels. I'm so glad to see you, Tess said in a halting voice. She was seated in a naturally formed rock chair. Tess looked very weak. She was disheveled, sunburned. Her lips were cracked and bloody. Pops and Amerigo took their pistols in hand and hopped around her chair's sides and did a quick search of the pinnacle area. But they were back in just a minute or so, and Pops asked her, "Are you alone here?" She nodded in reply. Leo handed her his opened canteen, saying, Drink a little. Just drink slowly." He removed his hat and placed it on her head. We gave her space and didn't ask any more questions. Pops and Amerigo built 3 small rock pillars around her and tied together shirts from their packs to make a sun shield. I dug into my pack for spare sunglasses and tore open an energy bar. I placed both on her lap, but she seemed kind of oblivious to them. She was oblivious to most everything. Pops held back the canteen whenever she tried to drink deeply. After several minutes, Tess said, I'll rest for a minute," and then closed her eyes. Pops and Amerigo left Leo and me in charge and scrambled off for a more careful survey of the entire rock formation. Returning after about 10 minutes, Pops said, "All this is natural rock. Nothing unusual about it, gang. No hiding places or trapdoors or any sign of other life. But we found you can move much faster up here on top than we could down in the desert plain. And as you know, the toughest going was down in that trough at the bottom of the ramp." At the sound of voices, Tess opened her eyes, and they were brighter than when we first encountered her. "Could I have some more water, please?" I opened my canteen and handed it to her. When she finished, I held the sunglasses up to her, and I placed the energy bar into her hand. Pops opened his pack, searched, and gave her a small vial of lip gel. She smeared it on and closed her eyes again. A few minutes later, she drank more. Then she took a bite of the bar. She made a face, but quickly finished it, straightened, and said, "Thank you all so much for coming. Where am I?" Amerigo replied, "You're in Africa, in the Kalahari Desert. Everyone was mystified at your disappearance. We thought you were kidnapped." Tess looked down, nodded, and said, "Oh, yeah, I can imagine that." Leo asked, "Tess, do you know what happened? Do you know how you got here?" For the first time, the old Tess was visible. She smiled. She smiled a big smile and said, "I'll answer, but the price will be more food." Leo handed her his bar. She pulled off the wrapper, took a bite, scrunched up her nose, and said, "It's all coming together now." "What do you mean?" I asked. Chapter 5. Heavy Stuff. Tess replied, "There was no kidnapping, not the criminal kind. Here's what happened. It was early evening. The quad was deserted, and most other students were either eating at the dining hall or they were cheering at the rally for the next day's football game. I started walking across the quadrangle to get to my car and head for dinner at Uncle Jim's. After about 3 steps, it was hard to move. At first, it was like walking through water at the beach, but soon it felt thicker. I plowed ahead, and when I reached the middle, I stopped to catch my breath and to try to figure out what was wrong. I was afraid I had a heart problem or something. All of a sudden, raucous noise blasted from the street. Horns were blowing, the marching band was blasting, and over 100 students were wailing out a fight song. The noise bounced off the dormitories and buildings and ricocheted back and forth. It was ear-splitting. The quad itself seemed to be vibrating. I started to feel oozy, and then I felt a push. Some force was pushing me away from the parade. It was jerky at first. I lost my balance but recovered. Then it became sustained, and I had to walk with it or be knocked over. And then I had to run. And after only a few strides, I was lifted up like a leaf to the level of tree branches. It was shocking, confusing. I was scared. I was afraid I'd lost my mind and asked myself if I had a heart attack and was dying. I flailed my arms and legs, but they moved in slow motion, and eventually I couldn't move them at all. Then I felt great pressure on my chest. Breathing became hard. I could take shallow breaths, but that was all. I rose higher in the air, and I watched walkways and walkway lights grow smaller. Then I was carried between buildings and out of the quad. It was surreal, dreamlike. I knew I was moving ever higher because car headlights and street lights became smaller. The lights became a blur, and I knew I was moving faster. Then I was in total darkness for a time, and then I was gyrated as though I was in a blender. It was still hard to breathe, but it didn't get worse. I felt no air movement. I knew I must be moving, but nothing. I was in a suspended state. It could have been hours, days even. I couldn't trust my sense of time. I couldn't trust anything. I'd imagined I'd become a two-dimensional cartoon drawing. I thought it'd never end, but darkness gradually gave way to light. And then I was slammed into the ground and skidded. I hit that dirt out there. It scraped my butt. She said all this with a smile, but she added, "But I won't show you." Tess gained at 4 open-mouthed faces. There I was alone in this desolate place. Nothing alive but me. I had trouble getting to my feet and found it hard to move. The air was thick, but not as thick as before. Only this pile of rocks broke up the emptiness. Then I realized, when I looked up, this peak might give me a chance to know where I was, so I climbed up the rock. It didn't help me know where I was, but I found I could breathe much better. This was way better, so I stayed. I was thirsty, and when the sun came overhead directly, I became so hot and dry, I felt like sliced bread in a toaster. I truly wasn't sure I was awake and dealing with a real situation. Well, then the sky darkened. It got cooler, and I could see sand piles rise in the distance. Loads of sand poured down on them. They kept growing, but nothing fell on me. She pointed around in a circle. I thought some evil thing was building prison walls to keep me here. I had no idea what I should do. Then hunger came on top of the thirst. I was exhausted, and when darkness came again, I fell asleep. I woke once in the dark. I wasn't hot or cold. Then light came again. I cried when light came because I knew I was awake and I knew it wasn't a dream I was in. My brain started to function, but I was still rooted in despair when Leo's beautiful face appeared above that ledge. Thank you, Leo. Thank you, everybody. Oh, I hope you're here to take me home. Pop said, Yes, Tess, we're here to take you home. After you've eaten and drunk more and your strength returns, we'll go to our vehicle just outside the sand mound. Pops offered her another energy bar, and she said, Thank you so much, but would you happen to have something different I could eat? While Pops rooted around in his pack, Leo said, Tess, the dense carbs and sugar in energy bars are more important than taste, and Tess interrupted. No, no, they have no sugar. You taste it. It's bland. But it does contain important information. Information about how I got here. Huh? I said. This was an elaborate kidnapping, right? Was Fun behind it? Hey, I was completely confused. No, no, Rookie. I wasn't kidnapped. Your suspicion makes sense, and yes, I was taken, but not by Fun. By wimps. Trillions and trillions of wimps. In her excitement, Tess started to stand up, but Pop stopped her and said, Stay seated until you have more water and food in you, please. But you can keep talking. We're all interested to know how you got here. Tess sat back down, took a deep breath, and continued. When the practical side of me pushed away despair an hour or so ago, I asked myself what could have transported me here. The clues I had were my difficulty walking and breathing and not being able to see the sources of forces moving me. As you know, I've been thinking about dark matter for months, and, truth is, maybe that's why my first answer to how I got here was wimps. My emotions said they had sought me out, that wimps had kidnapped me. Hey, but then it dawned on me, particles aren't living creatures. They can't have goals or plans, whether they're evil or good. But wimps, they could nevertheless have transported me. What if wimps had been in the quadrangle? They could have exerted pressure on my breathing and transported me here. I figured it was conceivable, but only if there was an enormously dense cluster of them. Then I asked, why would they cluster? Why would they cluster densely? To get my head around that, I asked, what do I know about clustering in nature on Earth? My first response was that birds cluster before migrating in flocks to reduce the risk of predators. I next thought about schools of fish. Clustering improves their defenses too. Fish schools have the ability to move to like a single unit, and that raises their defenses to an even higher level. When the side of a fish detects a change in the water pressure caused by a nearby fish turning, it immediately turns the same way and passes the same pressure on to the next fish. That's how they do it. There may be thousands in a school, but it appears that they act in just like they're acting with one mind. This made me think that maybe, just maybe, similar particles cluster and act in sophisticated ways, even though they're not yet alive. Then I asked, why would particles cluster if they don't have predators? And that brought me to a totally new idea. On Earth, particles join together to become elements. The elements you read about in chemistry class. Then elements join to become molecules. Molecules join to create cells. Cells create living organisms. So perhaps dark matter particles cluster just when they enter the initial stage of evolving into living organisms. What if by total chance the quad that evening had been the site of a hyperdense cluster of particles? It might have been the dark matter equivalent of Earth's primordial soup 4 billion years ago. Perhaps all around me, particles undetected by Earth scientists were then starting their own journey to life. Think of this. Maybe, like Dorothy in the movie The Wizard of Oz, I had been swept away as part of an amazing natural event. But while Dorothy had dreamed her story, mine was real. Hey guys, dehydration might be tricking my mind because I know you must be thinking I'm raving like a crazy person. But something brought me across the Atlantic Ocean, and it sure wasn't Fund Airlines. I asked, but Tess, why would wimps rush out of the quad? Rookie, the parade noise was wicked, and its intense waves may have disturbed the high-mast wimps and set in motion some kind of self-preservation reaction like a mammal's fight-flight instinct. I don't know. That's a wild guess, and since particles aren't living creatures, there may well be better answers. Leo asked, but what does all this have to do with you not liking the energy bar and saying it contained information? Well, I'm sure you remember my theory that bullies are a type of wimp that can interact with some of the elementary particles we study in physics class. The energy bar told me bullies are all around us right now. Now, bullies, I say that for two reasons. First, like other wimps, they're massive and powerfully attracted by gravity, and America interrupted. Suddenly the light dawns. That's why it was difficult to walk inside the dune ring and even harder to walk lower down on that ramp. She responded, exactly. And the second reason we know bullies are here is they interact with sugar molecules. They took the sugar from your energy bars, making them bland and bitter, just like they did with the Gator chocolate bars. We four would-be kidnapper thwarters looked at each other. Oh boy. And Leo said, nobody can prove Tess is right because science can't yet detect bullies. But Tess's theory makes complete sense to me. I wish we had devices that could detect those particles. Pop said, I'd love to scientifically detect them so to as as well as a boatload of amateur astronomers would love to do it. Pointing to the dune, he said, but there's no denying that empirical evidence of something dense covering this area and acting like a bull blocking sun from blowing in. Let's take photos of that whole ring for Tess's further research, and as well as for Amerigo's weather satellite people, and hey, for any scientists who believe wimps don't exist or just because I can't see them. He handed Tess a cheese sandwich, and he said, if this gives you your strength back, Tess, we'll get off these rocks, climb that dune, and head for home. Tess smiled broadly and said, with more than her usual enthusiasm, hey, sign me up for going home, and thank you all so much for putting up with my blather. She stood and handed Pops the shirts he'd used as her sun shield and said, let's go now, before something else weird happens. When Pop stashed the shirts, he pulled out his spare Red Sox hat for me, and we started out on our journey home. Chapter 6, The Trip Home. Now, Tess was probably still only partly recovered from her ordeal, but she navigated her way down the rock outcropping as well as the rest of us. When we reached the hardpan, I had the bright idea of digging my portable music system out of my pack and playing rowdy Irish songs to push aside bullies slowing us down. Brilliant, wasn't it? But then I figured out by the time I could dig that thing out from all the other junk I had in it, the others would probably have reached the dune and climbed up. Besides, I did have a brain left, I guess. It might not have disturbed the bullies enough to scatter them, and who knows? It might have set us all off on a Wizard of Oz journey like Tessa had just had. Well, we arrived at the top of the dune and looked out and took great satisfaction at seeing Amerigo's car still there. But then we looked down. Two men stood with automatic rifles aimed directly at us. A nice car you have there, people. We would like to borrow it, but she is well locked up. I am sure you would rather keep your lives than keep a black car that has anyway become so hot in the sun. Toss the keys here and continue to breathe, the leader said as he held his hand out, palm up. Following Pop's lead, we all dropped into the sand and slid partway back the way we climbed up. Pop said, "These fellows won't be able to climb much faster than we did. Boys, what do you have in your pack to deal with them? Non-lethal, of course." Leo groused, "Oh, rats, I didn't—" And I interrupted him, saying, "Leo, let me complete that sentence. Oh, rats, I didn't thank my brilliant brother for bringing a canister of my new Gel 9 air fogger that temporarily incapacitates those who breathe it. The one that's heavier than air so it can drift silently downhill and give our two new adversaries an afternoon nap. That's what you were going to say, Leo, isn't it?" Well, you can imagine Leo's response was nonverbal. Maybe not the nonverbal you were thinking of, but he just wound his hand around in circles, urging me to stop gabbing and get it out of my pack. When I had it in hand, I looked at Pops and he jerked his thumb toward the dune's edge. I carefully peered over, saw where they were climbing, removed the safety cap, pulled the trigger, and tossed into the sand a few meters above them. A fog of spray erupted immediately, and I retreated down to the others before the bandits could raise their weapons. After about 30 seconds, I climbed back up. I poked my head over the ridge. The two would-be hijackers were sprawled out at the bottom of the dune. I waved to the others, pointed, and I said, "Hey, let's go down over there and stay upwind of the gas." I gotta tell you, folks, I was feeling pretty cool, but, well, borrowing from Yogi Berra, it ain't over till it's over. We just made it down the dune when a plume of dust arose in the near distance. It quickly morphed into two Land Rovers, one with a machine gun mounted on back. 4 of us watched, but Amerigo turned his back to the intruders. The trucks pulled up sharply in front of us and sent a big dust cloud into our faces. A guy wearing a Yankees baseball cap stood through the Rover's open roof and said, "You know what we want? Toss the keys here and live to walk away." We all stood in silence, tense and worried that they'd do something violent to spur us to action. Then behind them a small puff of dust appeared, and we watched as Blackie rose silently, tripping a bit of sand. I made a show of taking off my backpack and searching through it, tossing stuff out. I wanted to attract the bandits' attention. The others looked toward me so their eyes wouldn't give away Blackie's approach. She arrived ahead of her shadow and hovered over the 2 Rovers. The bandit leader looked up, Amerigo touched a button, and Blackie dropped down with a force that was powerful, but it was delicate and controlled. The gas tank came down on the Yankees' cap. The 2 windscreens shattered, the roofs crumpled, the machine gun broke off, but the cabs were not crushed. We heard shouts but saw no blood. Amerigo looked down at the gadget in his hand and pressed some buttons, and Blackie turned in midair and came quietly to rest beside us. We hopped in like jackrabbits and were off in a cloud of dust. As Blackie bounced over the hard pan and onto the highway, Amerigo said, "Glad she had a little aviation fuel in reserve. There's still a bit more in case we have to plow through some other kinds of bullies. Oh, Tess, there's very little traffic on this road ahead, so just lean back and get yourself some real sleep." The drive to Windhoek's airport was uneventful, and Amerigo's plane flew us to Denver with only a brief stop. It was a stop for a joy-filled reunion for Tess and her family in Fort Myers. So that was the end of our non-kidnapping adventure. I guess it was a mystery, really. I realize all this stuff about wimps and bullies may sound crazy, but if you have another explanation for what happened to Tess, I'd love to hear it. The last thing I'll mention is when Leo and I returned to school. Well, we got a load of guff from our teachers for skipping, but as you can well imagine, we didn't care. Friends take care of friends. We'd taken a gamble, and it worked. And that's the end.